What transformed a bare patch of gravel into something unforgettable in 1958? The answer wasn't only on the glowing screen. It was tied to the way the country itself was changing after the war. Families were leaving crowded city apartments for suburban tracks that appeared almost overnight. The automobile became more than a way to get somewhere. It was the emblem of that new life. Car ownership had become widespread, and with it came the freedom to travel outward, to open spaces where land was inexpensive and waiting to be used. Those edges of town became the natural setting for a new kind of gathering, the drive-in theater. From the field itself, the most imposing feature was the towering rectangle of the screen. By day, it looked plain, little more than painted boards on a frame. But once the projector light ignited, it glowed against the darkness, brighter than any building miles around. Cars angled into tidy rows before it, creating the sense of an outdoor auditorium. Families coasted in, switched off engines, and waited in a mood that was part anticipation, part ritual. Young children tugged at their parents after leaving the playground nearby. Simple swings, or a slide set up just to fill time before the show began. Near the middle of the lot was the square concession stand, glowing with painted trim and wide glass windows. It stood as the true hub, more social than the screen itself. Inside, the counter clattered with trays while teenagers jostled to buy sodas that gathered beads of moisture in the summer air. Tired parents stopped for coffee, stretching their legs before retreating back to their cars. Management in some theaters even offered small conveniences, like bottle warmers for infants, reminders that this space was designed to welcome whole families. The gravel paths echoed with footsteps and low conversation, the sound of people sharing the security of a modest prosperity after years of rationing. It's worth noting how widespread this pattern had become. By 1958, there were more than 4,000 drive-ins across the United States. From state to state, neon arrows guided cars from highways onto dirt or gravel access roads, into fields that sometimes held a few dozen vehicles, and other times nearly 1,000. However large or small, each had the same essential pieces: the glowing screen, the neat rows of cars angled toward it, and that bright concession box at the center. Together, these ingredients made up the framework of Saturday night. The novelty lay in how those pieces were used. Until then, the family car belonged to the road or the daily commute. At the drive-in, something different emerged. The car became a living room, parked under the stars. Children curled into blankets on the back seats, dozing before the feature ended. Teenagers leaned toward the windshield, eyes caught between the movie flickering above and the cars inching into spaces nearby. Parents reclined in the front, windows lowered. A whole household gathered together for an evening that remained affordable, yet felt special. Admission covered everyone who could fit inside. Food could be brought from home. And still, the night had the charm of something out of the ordinary. The drive-in thrived not only on practical value, but on the way simple parts fused into one experience. A plain screen of lumber, a small square building, and rows of parked cars were everyday sights in daylight. But here, under a wide night sky, they seemed to gain new meaning. Neon buzzed along painted signs, voices carried across rows. A cool summer breeze lifted conversation, mixing with the faint hum of idling engines. Each turn of an ignition key, each speaker lifted to a window, became part of a shared performance that was being acted out in small towns and growing suburbs alike. What made the gravel lot dream matter was not just entertainment, but the sense of belonging. People gathered without leaving behind their own familiar space. Home came with them, framed in chrome and upholstery. At the same time, they joined into something public, sitting together beneath the same flickering images that spread across a whole nation. A person might not think they were part of anything larger than Friday night in their own town. Yet they were, repeating the same gestures in step with millions of others. That is why the setting carried such a quiet power. Still, even with the glow of the screen and the buzz of the concession stand, those features were not what gave the theater its full life. The heartbeat came from what filled the rows. The cars themselves, polished and waiting, and the voices of the people who brought them through the gate. Among them were the ones who gave Saturday nights a particular energy, rolling in with chrome, gleaming a little brighter than the rest. It was there, in that glow, that another story began to unfold. Why did teenagers polish their cars more carefully on Saturdays than any other day? The answer reached far beyond neatness or wiping away fingerprints. By the late 1950s, America had more than 67 million registered cars, and every one of them represented more than transport. It was mobility, responsibility, even identity. At the drive-in, that identity stepped into public view. First impressions came not from conversation, but from what the headlights revealed. The gleam of paint under neon, the soft curve of fenders catching twilight, and the particular way a car settled proudly into its space. As the gravel filled, the performance began. Engines quieted into low grumbles as cars slid into alignment. One by one, headlights clicked off and left a field of silhouettes against the growing dark. Alongside the concession stand, or leaning on doors, teenagers adjusted themselves as carefully as the polish on their cars. A single paragraph held the whole ritual. Hair combed till it gleamed, lipstick checked in pocket mirrors, shirts tucked sharp, skirts neat but light for the humid night. The car shone, the driver carried it, and together they stood as a triangle of pride. Parents' income in providing it, teenage labor in maintaining it, romantic potential in showing it off. To walk past the rows was to walk through a silent measure of reputation, mettle and posture, speaking long before any words did. Families brought with them a different energy. Station wagons eased over the gravel with children jostling in the back, pajamas already replacing daytime outfits. Coolers thudded down beside bumpers, lawn chairs unfolded, and sandwiches, cookies, or soda emerged to keep budgets in check. Blankets tucked around younger ones as the night stretched on. Here was the practical America, in contrast to the ritual of its teenagers. One group shaping early independence, the other preserving comfort and economy. And yet the two lived side by side, each claiming their own territory in the same vast lot. Language too added texture to the scene. Terms like cool cat, square, and maid in the shade circled among young voices, part of the shorthand of style. They were not mathematical counts of speech, but pieces of sound, accents of a culture that measured belonging in gesture, tone, and phrase. Just as the chrome reflected neon, those small turns of words reflected who was in rhythm with the moment and who was outside of it. Once parked, the automobiles turned into private corners. They were public enough to display, private enough for whispers inaudible to the next row. Couples in the front seat leaned closer over the static of a tinny speaker clipped to a window. Parents in wider wagons spoke quietly while their children dozed behind them. In these rectangles of steel and glass, families and adolescents found rare privacy in the open air. A string of small rooms without walls, lined together beneath the same sky. Hierarchy settled in quickly. Those with newer models or gleaming finishes drew glances. Those who arrived early placed themselves perfectly, neither craning upwards at the front nor peering small from the edges. A smooth-running engine murmured of care and reliability, while a rough muffler invited smirks or quick jokes. Flashier touches, hubcaps catching stray beams, blankets stretched onto hoods, or custom speakers laid near doors, added to the quiet competition. No announcement was needed. Everyone in the lot knew which car held the most standing. For adolescents, this pageant mattered as much as the feature to come. Drive-ins often programmed the kinds of B-horror and sci-fi pictures that younger audiences loved. Knowing the draw was as much about atmosphere as story. The glowing rectangle in the distance was backdrop to the real drama. Nervous laughter, first dates with all their small adjustments, friendships measured in snack line chatter, and the assertion of independence in how loudly an engine was revved on arrival. To many, the drive-in was not a movie house at all. It was the proving ground of youth. Seen this way, the gravel rows were not just parking spaces, but stages arranged across an outdoor amphitheater. They held lived stories of adolescence, confidence tested, admiration won or lost, romance born in hurried words. For a teenager stepping from one world to another, the lot was less about Clark Gable or Deborah Kerr flickering high above, more about the moment one's name, one's car, and one's place found recognition among peers. Then the rhythm shifted. The last engines cut with a shiver into the night, leaving the field in a hush, broken only by insects and the mechanical hum at the back of the lot. Chrome dimmed as projector light blazed forward, casting its reach over vehicles now reduced to dark silhouettes. Whatever contests had just played out, they gave way at once to a shared stillness. All faces now turned in the same direction, toward the broad, white canvas waiting to fill with images. And that shared stillness raised a question that each twilight repeated. What kind of picture could carry such a mixed gathering? Children restless, parents weary, young couples alert with expectation, through the next 2 hours beneath the stars. Beneath the stars, a screen beneath the stars had a special kind of power. On those warm nights in 1958, its glow stretched far past the gravel lot, pulling every pair of eyes toward it. The question for drive-in owners was always programming, choosing films that could hold the attention of restless children, satisfy weary parents, and still give teenagers something to talk about the next morning. The solution most often came in a simple but ingenious format: the double feature. One ticket meant 2 movies, balancing needs across the audience. Typically, the first slot was reserved for a prestige picture, an adaptation or well-known studio release that parents would feel was worth the outing. Films like South Pacific, Gigi, or Cat on a Hot Tin Roof filled that place in the schedule, offering music or drama with familiar stars. The second slot, late at night, leaned into the cheap thrills younger crowds craved. A horror like The Fly or a fast-paced sci-fi adventure gave teenagers the suspense and spectacle they expected. The pairing worked because it promised something for everyone, ensuring families stayed until the last reel. These B-movies bloomed especially well in the drive-in environment. Monsters, space races, outlaw gunfighters. These were all stories told with exaggerated action and broad strokes that did not require quiet concentration. A giant insect towering on screen felt twice its size outdoors, framed against the horizon. A sudden scream echoed sharper in the night air than it ever could indoors. These films may not have won awards, but they fit their setting perfectly. Hollywood studios of that era pushed technology to help theaters fight back against television, which was steadily keeping more Americans at home. By 1958, home TVs were still mostly black and white, small screens set in heavy wooden boxes. In contrast, Hollywood leaned on widescreen and Technicolor to offer spectacles small TVs could not match. Drive-ins embraced those tools fully. Widescreen panoramas stretched across towering outdoor screens, swallowing entire rows of cars within their reach. Technicolor washed the lot in vibrant reds, greens, and yellows that bounced off chrome bumpers and filled windshields like moving mosaics. A row of parked cars became a field of tiny mirrors, each one catching a piece of sky-sized storytelling. From the perspective of a back seat, the effect could feel overwhelming. Figures on screen loomed like giants, towering larger than buildings in the distance. Faces filled the entire horizon. Battle scenes flashed and turned the gravel bright for moments at a time. Sitting in the dark, you were not simply watching a projection. You were surrounded by an event, one where color and motion seemed to seep into everything around you. That experience stood in sharp relief beside what most families saw at home. Televisions offered a narrow, quiet view of the world, a box that flickered tiredly in the living room corner. Sitcoms played in thin sound, while household chores continued. By contrast, the drive-in demanded attention from the entire body. Images flooded over windshields, dialogue carried out into open air, and laughter or gasps came not just from a speaker box, but in unison across hundreds of people. The difference was not subtle. It marked the drive-in as a gathering space at a time when television kept everyone indoors. To sit at the drive-in was to remember how much of the show depended on more than the story itself. Soundless elements, the scale of the screen, the color bleeding into the night, the simple act of sharing it among strangers, all turned film into atmosphere. Even stray activity near the fence line, like a neighbor's dog stopping to stare into the glow, seemed drawn into the spectacle. The screen had become a giant mural in motion, framed not by walls, but by stars. Still, the ritual of watching followed its natural rhythm. The first feature rolled, a break stretched just long enough to refill drinks or grab another snack, and the second film pulled the crowd back toward quiet focus. By then, children curled under blankets often dozed in the rear seats. Parents whispered and sipped their last coffees. Teenagers returned from the concession stand or gravel paths, settling for the final act. The audience shifted shape as the night wore on, but no group entirely left. The double feature contract promised more than a single story. And even when the films themselves were ordinary, the experience transformed them. Music numbers appeared larger than life, romance drew sighs that rippled across rows, and monsters briefly made silhouettes on barn-sized walls. Few left remembering only plot. They left remembering how it felt, the echo of light across steel, the grand stage above their windshields projecting out into the night sky. For all its grandeur, however, one detail grounded that wonder, reminding everyone they were still sitting in cars on gravel lots. The images may have filled the heavens, but the way they sounded carried its own peculiar limit. To understand that, you have to listen more closely to the crackle and the thin tone of something that never quite matched the majesty of the picture overhead. The images might have filled the sky, but the sound rested in something far more modest, a small gray box clipped to the edge of a car window. Every vehicle in the lot had one within reach, a tin speaker with a coiled wire running back to a post in the gravel. It rattled when fastened, buzzed when adjusted, and carried a constant undertone of static. Families learned to accept its quirks. A line of dialogue might fade, a trumpet might flatten, but the voice that came through belonged entirely to the experience of being there. Children grew up remembering the gentle hum of those units as surely as the flicker of the projector light. The in-car speaker itself marked a step forward, not an accident of poor design. RCA first introduced it in 1941, giving every car at the drive-in its own channel. Before then, sound had been broadcast over large horns mounted near the screen, often bleeding into nearby neighborhoods. The shift to personal speakers concentrated the experience inside the vehicle, even if the sound brought with it a thin tin texture. Audiences came to know that texture as something distinct, a signal that they had left behind the polish of city theaters for the casual atmosphere of the open lot. Inside the speaker, sound compression clipped the highs and swallowed the bass, reducing the sweep of a full orchestra to a flat chorus. A gunshot turned into a sharp pop, a violin layered into a faint hum well beneath its stage version. Songs carried less precision, spoken words less body. Yet the limitation did not erase enjoyment. The sound became its own kind of marker, a tactile reminder of where you were and who surrounded you. Ask visitors years later what returns most vividly, and many will call up that buzz between lines of dialogue or the creak of the metal clamp against the window frame, rather than the details of any single film. Not all the noise came from the little boxes. Even before the projector beam cut through the night, the lot was alive with music from car radios. Teenagers rolled down windows, tuning dials until static broke into rhythm. Elvis Presley's voice lined up against Chuck Berry's guitar, while Connie Francis found space in the quieter corners. Sometimes, 3 different songs tumbled together in the same strip of gravel, a kind of unplanned collage laid across the evening air. Couples leaned against car hoods, swaying on the balls of their feet, while others laughed and sang along. The drive-in's field became as much a dance floor as a theater, the music setting mood long before the feature began. The overlapping of sounds created an atmosphere unlike city movie houses. At the downtown cinema, ushers hushed conversation and curtains blocked the intrusion of the street. Here, by contrast, a visitor heard layers. Children calling from the playground, the grind of shoes on gravel, radios cutting in and out, the metallic clink of cup dispensers at the concession stand across the lot. By the time the announcer signaled showtime, the drive-in was already alive with a score of its own, one written day by day in the chaos of families, engines, and radios. When films began, the little speakers filled their role in earnest. Windows closed against mosquitoes, units clipped tight, and voices inside each car dropped low. Yet not every speaker performed the same. Some delivered dialogue with surprising sharpness, almost clean, while the next row over a family might strain against distortion. A small tug on the cord could whistle or shriek, drawing startled laughter from children. These imperfections became part of the rhythm. Shared glances between cars made it clear that everyone had faced the same situation at one time or another, and it bound the crowd in easy recognition. As the years went forward, operators tried to improve what people heard. The most important change came with radio broadcasting inside the lot. Instead of clipping a shared speaker to the window, cars could tune directly to a low-power FM band transmitted across the field. This solved more than one frustration. The sound grew clearer, matched to each car's own speakers, and the old, forgotten speaker, mishaps, where a family drove away with the unit still hanging from the window, began to disappear. In time, FM broadcasting would overtake the wire-bound system entirely, though in 1958, the buzz of those little boxes still defined the evening. Teenagers, in particular, claim that sound as their own. The crackle and faint hiss was not a flaw in their eyes, but proof they were out in the world. It was not their parents' radio console in the living room, warm and polished. It was the raw texture of gravel underfoot, the scatter of headlights, and the squeeze of two people on a bench seat. Couples on dates often remembered less about the film than about the way the speaker blurred into the night, the small soundtrack to whispered words and careful movements. Taken together, the drive-in's audio was less about clarity than about texture. Engines coughed one last time before shutting off. Feet scuffed paths to the brightly lit stand at the center lot. Radios carried fragments of rock and roll over the static, while dozens of small speakers overlaid it all with dialogue and song. Out of that mixture came an atmosphere where no one felt compelled to hold back. Parents laughed freely. Children cried without warning. Teenagers spoke in low voices, untroubled by echoes. It was a community of sound as much as of sight. Looked at beside the formal polish of indoor theaters, these nights stood apart. Polished curtains, velvet seats, and precision speakers offered grandeur, while the drive-in offered participation. Rough edges made their own kind of memory. No one carried home the tonal perfection of the orchestra pit, but many carried home the tinny echo that seemed stitched into the smell of summer grass and car upholstery. The very imperfection formed its own permanence. And so, the sound became an emblem. Parents remembered it as background to affordable family outings, couples as accompaniment to fragile romance, teenagers as the mark of freedom. Even now, when many screens have dimmed for good, the echo lives on, as if those old boxes still rest on a line of windows, humming faintly under starlight. Yet there was another layer to these nights. Just as crucial as the glow of the projector or the song of the speaker. Off to the side of every lot stood a different kind of beacon, one whose windows cast light across gravel and faces alike. It asked for attention in a more earthly way, not with stories on screen, but with smells, warmth, and food waiting behind glass. Why did the brightest light in the lot often come not from the films, but from those glowing windows where food and drink were waiting? The concession stand was more than decoration. it was essential. In most drive-ins, ticket sales alone didn't sustain the business. A car full of people could roll in for a single admission bill, but once parked, the smell of popcorn, frying burgers, and sweet syrupy cola called them toward the stand. Many operators kept admission modest, depending on concession sales to make the venue profitable. The appeal began in the air itself. Warm breezes carried the crackle of popcorn tumbling in glass tubs and the hiss of burgers pressed against hot steel. Behind wide windows, cups fizzed as they filled, and candy bars lined shelves in neat rows of color. Stepping into that space felt like entering a carnival distilled into a single counter. For a few minutes, cars, screens, and radios faded, replaced by the clatter of trays, the shuffle in line, and the pulse of glowing neon. Families navigated these temptations with a quiet kind of calculation. Concession prices stretched budgets. So many parents packed coolers with sandwiches, fruit, or foil-wrapped leftovers. Theaters knew it and rarely took action, since most cars carried at least some home-stocked supplies. Yet the pull of the stand was hard to ignore. When the lights on the screen shifted to intermission and the famous cartoon trays of soda and popcorn marched across it, children began pointing and tugging. Parents resisted, but usually not for long. The cartoon soon became part of the ritual itself. A wink that everyone knew meant it was time for a walk to the counter. Concession stands grew into miniature hubs that provided more than food. Larger lots added small playgrounds nearby so children could be occupied while parents ordered. Some even stocked vending machines with practical items like diapers, or coffee counters for drowsy adults preparing for a late drive home. Their layout blurred the line between theater and community square. Whether buying food or just stepping in to stretch legs, families couldn't avoid brushing against neighbors, classmates, or coworkers. In that moment, the evening's crowd shifted from rows of metal and glass into something closer to a fairground gathering. When intermission came, the whole lot moved as though on cue. Headlights flicked on for navigation, doors slammed, and gravel filled with quick footsteps. Lines stretched toward the counter, voices layered into warm, noisy echoes. Children pressed faces to glass. Parents studied chalkboard menus. Teenagers clustered in half-serious conversation by the walls. In those stretches of 10 or 15 minutes, the concession stand replaced the screen as the true center of activity. It was not just a place to eat. It was the place to be seen, to trade glances, to feel part of the larger group. For the owners, this movement was everything. Concessions were essential to profitability. Owners counted on food and drink sales as the primary source of ongoing revenue. A handful of purchases could outweigh several cars' worth of ticket sales. The math worked best when crowds left their vehicles and entered the building in numbers, and all the music, ads, and rituals pulsed toward that goal. Every milkshake split between teenagers, every box of popcorn shared between tired parents and wide-eyed children carried the weight of keeping the screen lights operating week after week. This economic truth meant the food was never just a background detail. Ask a parent from 1958 what they remember, and often it isn't only the film titles or the cars, but the exact taste of warm popcorn paired with cold soda on a humid night. Teenagers remembered the slow walk back across gravel, holding a paper tray that symbolized time spent together. Owners remembered the clink of coins against the register drawer as the lifeblood of the place. The concession stand was not accessory. It was the heart muscle that kept the whole theater alive. Set at the center of the lot, the stand's glow created its own stage. Bright as a lighthouse, it was where conversations overlapped, shoulders brushed, and rituals formed without announcement. Even those who had brought their own food found themselves drifting past its windows during the pause. It tied the evening together, giving rhythm to the long sit inside the cars. First the feature began, then the intermission called people out. Then the crowd returned with bags and cups, ready for the night's second act. To remember the drive-in is to remember those moments just as much as the pictures on screen. The crunch of gravel on the way to the stand, the hiss of soda poured into waxed cups, the salt of popcorn on your fingers. They formed the tactile layers beneath the evening. For children, that walk defined the whole trip. For adults, it was the point they stretched their backs and exchanged greetings. Those small rituals gave the drive-in its social shape, ensuring it was never only about cars facing a glowing wall in silence. Still, food could only do so much. It warmed the night, brought neighbors together, padded profits, and soothed children's restlessness. But in the wider sense, it didn't touch the undercurrents that lingered nearby, the background feelings of an America both prosperous and uneasy. The same headlights that led families to the concession windows also belonged to a nation living with hidden tension. And in the patterns of those rows, shining faintly in the dark, another story was quietly present, one that reached beyond popcorn and tableside chatter. Could a gravel lot filled with cars really mirror the anxieties and hopes of a whole nation? In 1958, as white screens glowed above the rows, many thought so. On the surface, the drive-in was simple: an open field, scattered posts with speakers, and a high rectangle of painted boards brought alive by projection. Yet within those boundaries, much of America's mood could be read. The optimism of chrome and new suburbs, the shadow of mushroom clouds, the tension of both progress and unease existing at once. The physical location itself offered clues. Most drive-ins sat at town edges, where land was cheap and expansion was underway. Families were already moving outward, chasing the promise of fresh lawns and cul-de-sacs. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 sped that outward push, threading ribbons of asphalt across the country and making car travel central to daily life. Drive-ins grew naturally in that environment, at the borders of new neighborhoods, just where highways met quiet fields. While looking across the lot in neat rows of cars was a bit like glancing at the orderly lines of new houses spreading across the landscape. Both spoke of a desire for structure, space, and calm predictability in unsettled times. For children who trotted toward playground swings and candy counters, the evening was light and uncomplicated. For teenagers, it carried more freedom, a place apart from the watchful eyes at home. For many parents, though, the dark sky above carried heavier meaning. These were years when headlines spoke of weapons trials, missile gaps, and Cold War standoffs. Families dug shallow shelters in their yards, while schools held duck and cover drills. The sky they looked at during a film was the same sky that, in their quietest thoughts, might someday bring danger. For some, the giant screen offered not just entertainment, but a brief shield. 2 hours in which color and music distracted them from the background tension of the era. The technological moment only sharpened this feeling. In 1957, Americans had looked upward to see Sputnik circling overhead. By 1958, NASA was established to respond to that new frontier, and every family knew that science and defense were advancing at rapid speed. That leap into space was thrilling, but also deeply unsettling. Sitting at a drive-in, watching colossal images flash across the horizon, people were already measuring their own lives against rockets, satellites, and the idea of tomorrow rushing toward them. Awe and anxiety blurred, just as monster films and musicals blurred together on the schedule. Despite these undercurrents, the audience was diverse. Veterans back from war, parked beside young couples still uncertain about mortgages. Factory workers in greasy overalls stood in the same lines as mothers in crisp skirts, each reaching for trays of fries or sodas. Teenagers arrived in borrowed cars, carefully polished, squeezing in as many friends as a vehicle could carry. Younger children swatted mosquitoes or trailed behind, still sticky from playground dust. It wasn't perfect equality, but it was an unusual mix in a decade when so much of American life was split by class, neighborhood, or club membership. The drive-in, because of its price and its setting, opened the night to a broader group than many other spaces. The field could act almost like a soup, different parts mingling gently together. Not everyone spoke, but everyone shared the same focus. Dozens of arms reached for paper cups. Dozens of radios flickered around the lot before showtime. Dozens of windshields pointed at the same glowing square. In an era where life at home or in church often divided groups along sharper lines, this small mingling felt significant. For some, that was the greatest comfort. Not only escape, but escape joined with others. What gave the gathering such power was paradox. The drive-in pulled people away from fear, but it only worked because those fears were shared. To sit in that lot meant knowing other families carried the same burdens of mortgage worries, political headlines, or quiet thoughts about what sirens might sound like if war came. Teenagers polishing chrome for admiration were aware that other teenagers just a few feet away were doing the same. Children laughing on one side of the playground heard their own sound echoed back in the squeals of others. The whole place breathed with collective recognition. The Cold War sharpened that recognition further. As global tension escalated, simple rituals began to mean more. People valued the reliability of the program. There would always be a cartoon midway through, always an intermission for ice cream, always headlights blinking on together at the night's end. That dependability, that habit, carried weight in a time when much else felt uncertain. For many, stability itself was what they sought most. Each Saturday night reinforced the belief that amid headlines about missiles or space races, there was still something steady in a paper bag of popcorn, a family squeezed into a station wagon, or a Technicolor love story glowing on the horizon. In this way, the drive-in was more than a novelty. It became a small emblem of suburban optimism. The careful rows of cars echoed faith in structure. The bright screen carried the promise of progress and narrative order. Children's laughter softened the edge of frightening drills and newspaper talk. Couples leaning close symbolized futures able to stretch beyond unease. To watch the screen was not only to enjoy entertainment, but to witness, night after night, hopeful rehearsals for a more peaceful tomorrow. None of this meant the experience was the same for everyone. Not every parent felt their tension ease. Not every veteran found comfort in the glow. Some saw the night merely as inexpensive leisure, nothing more than fried snacks and flickering images. Yet even then, the design of the field and the collective rhythm of its rituals gave something like reassurance. The very act of taking part hinted that order was possible, that gathering together meant more than isolation at home. To many, that made the evening feel larger than the films themselves. From the roadside, though, an observer might have missed all this reflection. To them, it may have looked like burgers and soda, bright rectangles, and idle chatter on summer nights. Still, within the ordered grid of parked cars, people were quietly shaping ways to face uncertain decades. Fragile optimism steadied itself through repetition and ritual, even while the world beyond carried threats. But of course, not every passenger shared in reflective calm or sober reassurance. Some came for their own reasons entirely. In the shadowed back rows, laughter turned rowdy, whispers turned daring, and plans unfolded that parents preferred not to imagine. The story of the drive-in was never only about order and escape. It also carried the restless mischief that found its place once the lights went down. Some corners of the lot gained reputations that spread quickly, whispered among parents, and reported in columns. Newspapers in the late 1950s often labeled certain drive-ins passion pits, a phrase repeated with half serious worry and half amusement. The nickname stuck precisely because everyone knew there were different kinds of evenings unfolding behind those rows of windshields. The bright front rows of families came with their picnic baskets and wagons full of children. But farther back, dimmer patches of gravel carried a different energy. That energy found form in small acts of daring. Teenagers, with gate fees low and space plentiful, saw the drive-in as a place where rules stretched. Sneaking friends past the ticket booth became a test of ingenuity, sometimes hidden beneath blankets in the back seat, other times crammed briefly into a trunk before re-emerging with released laughter. The mechanics of these stunts mattered less than the sensation, the rush of a shared secret, the proof that youth could bend the boundaries of adult order. The story retold later was not about how someone crouched in darkness for a few minutes, but the joy of stepping out into the night, victorious, shoulder to shoulder with friends. Once cars settled into their rows, another kind of mischief began, quieter but no less memorable. In the dappled shadows, windows drew fog from nervous breaths, and the buzz of a tin speaker blurred as background to tentative gestures. A first kiss in the back of a sedan, a hesitant hand finding another across the vinyl seat. These became the true milestones. Awkward, clumsy, often brief, but unforgettable. It was less scandal than initiation. Private discoveries made not far from the glowing rectangle of the screen. Adolescents may not have remembered the titles of the films, but they remembered the pulse in their own chest and the way the evenings seemed to belong only to them. Patterns soon became visible to anyone who observed carefully. Wagons parked closer to the front, where playgrounds promised distraction for younger children. Families clustered near the concession stand lights. Teenagers gravitated to the shadows, choosing their spots deliberately at the edges or back rows, half part of the crowd, but also apart from it. Some nights were boisterous, with loud calls, car horns, and sudden laughter. Other nights were hushed, broken only by distant voices. Parents recognized the zones of difference, often shaking their heads, but rarely doing more. The ease of the outing, low cost, children kept busy, simple entertainment, was enough for most to overlook what they quietly suspected was happening beyond their direct sight. Outside, voices often magnified these suspicions. Editorials fretted over whether drive-ins offered wholesome family recreation, or whether they encouraged wayward behavior once the lights dropped. Church bulletins sometimes repeated the warnings. Yet newspapers also praised the comfort of children safe in their parents' back seats. The appeal of seeing first-run pictures without the trouble of downtown crowds. The communal joy of a summer night shared across dozens of families. This dual reputation gave the drive-in its curious position in 1958, celebrated as a family investment and whispered about as a youthful testing ground all at once. Through the years, what endured in memory rarely separated the two. Nostalgia blended together the innocent and the mischievous until they were inseparable. Ask an adult today who once sat in those rows, and they are less likely to remember the plot of The Fly than the taste of salted popcorn on a humid night, the nervous laugh escaping in a moment of silence, or the image of a friend climbing out of a car trunk with a grin. Both pranks and tenderness counted because both carried the same undercurrent. These were the moments when adolescence quietly pushed against the boundaries set by adults. This is why the label Passion Pit, despite its sensational tone, never quite captured the lived truth. What most teenagers sought was not license for scandal, but a first grasp of independence. Inside those parked vehicles, they discovered friendship, attraction, or simply the joy of being out past curfew with peers. For many, the drive-in was less a place of transgression and more a classroom of feelings, awkward but essential, often remembered with gratitude rather than regret. With time, reputation shifted further. As the decades moved on and television drew families indoors, some theaters turned to different strategies. Historically, a handful of drive-ins began filling their late-night hours with exploitation reels or adult fare, adopting sharper programming as a way to hold on to shrinking audiences. By then, the Passion Pit reputation hardened. The earlier blend of innocence and mischief had been joined by more deliberate provocation. But in the summer of 1958, the mixture still leaned toward the playful and the personal. The unforgettable memories came not from scandal, but from small, fumbling rites of passage lived under the vast screen. The result was a legacy far heavier than any single ticket stub. Mischief, secrecy, laughter, and affection became part of what people remembered when they spoke of drive-ins years later. These recollections were as central to their meaning as the musicals, thrillers, or comedies projected above. They explained why the spaces lingered in cultural imagination, not simply for the movies shown, but for the steps toward freedom and self-identity traced in their shadows. Standing back now, decades later, one might still picture those rows. The sleepy child carried out in pajamas at the end of a double feature. The teenager pressing close during a hesitant song on the soundtrack. The friend tumbling out of hiding in the trunk as laughter filled the air. These memories embody why the drive-in is remembered with such force. It was not only what shone on the screen, but what quietly unfolded between frames. It was a living record of how freedom felt the moment it was discovered. And yet, the story cannot stay within the boundaries of one field. To understand 1958 is to notice what stretched beyond headlights and neon, the wider web of events shaping that year. If the gravel lot captured private memories, the larger world outside framed the atmosphere in which those memories were born. What was happening in 1958 beyond the glow of neon and the smell of popcorn? It was a country suspended between calm routine and the stirrings of extraordinary change. Dwight Eisenhower was still in the White House, projecting caution and stability, but beneath the steady tone lay faint tremors of transformation. The Cold War remained the silent backdrop of every headline, mixing with suburban comforts in an uneasy balance. Only a year earlier, the Soviet launch of Sputnik startled Americans into glancing upward at the night sky. By 1958, the United States had answered by creating NASA, an agency meant to make space not fantasy, but national project. Rockets and satellites were suddenly woven into the fabric of daily life, even as lawns were trimmed and hula hoops spun in the driveway. The country was reshaping faster on the ground as well. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 had triggered construction of the interstate system, a vast grid of roads that redefined how people traveled, worked, and played. Suburbs stretched outward, tied together by asphalt that made the family car even more central. Drive-ins thrived at the edges of these new roadways, exactly where fields met neighborhoods and new patterns of life emerged. The highway system made it easier to reach the neon arrows on Saturday night, while NASA's creation filled conversations with a future that seemed to leap beyond the stars. The setting of a drive-in, a giant screen under a wide sky, sat naturally at the intersection of these two impulses, grounded but forward-looking, ordinary yet touched by the extraordinary. Sports carried their own sense of continuity. Baseball still reigned, secure in its role as national pastime. The Yankees in particular seemed more dynasty than club. Their victories beamed through radios and printed in headlines that traveled swiftly across the country. Children in rural towns carried gloves to backyard games, living within the stories they heard in play-by-play accounts. Football, more regional until then, began pressing forward into national awareness. Sunday broadcasts pulled communities indoors, nudging traditions to widen. These rhythms mattered not just for entertainment, but for identity. They reminded families of who they felt they were. Strong, routine-bound, always measuring themselves against champions. Yet the deepest competitor to outdoor screens was not a rival sport, but a box in the living room. By 1958, televisions had become a fixture in nearly every home. Families crowded before black and white sets, surrounding themselves with comedy, news, and music. For many, this seemed the safer, cheaper option. No fuel spent, no weather endured, no coins juggled. Neighbors shared large screens, huddling in houses where one family could afford the latest technology. The intimacy of indoor light posed a question. Why leave home when you could sit in slippers and watch? The answer lay not in the list of films, but in scale and atmosphere. A drive-in offered something television could not: the screen immense, technicolor filling the horizon, stories stretching across rows of cars. The experience was as communal as it was visual. Children sprawled across blankets. Teenagers leaned close as the cool air sharpened voices. Parents sipped coffee while watching the same horizon everyone else faced. It was messy, noisy, and social in a way television never could touch. The difference was simple. Television belonged to the quiet of the living room, while the drive-in invited people into a gathering, into spectacle larger than themselves. This contrast went deeper than media preference. It reflected two modes of life. Indoors meant control, curtains drawn, slippers at rest, observation from within four walls. Outdoors meant bugs, gravel crunching beneath feet, neighbors brushing elbows and concession lines, but also a shared pulse that reminded people they belonged to something larger. The choice was a mirror: safety or exposure, comfort or community, inward focus or outward reach. Neither fully displaced the other, but together they captured how the late 1950s lived with its dual personality. And so the drive-in became a kind of cultural midpoint. It sat at the hinge of optimism and dread, play and preparation. On one hand, Americans stockpiled canned food in basements, held drills in schools, and scanned stars for missiles. On the other, they placed blankets in cars, bought popcorn, and cheered for cowboys or bug-eyed monsters projected across towering screens. Drive-ins reflected this balance without stating it outright. They turned national tension into a ritual of relaxation, held weekly at the edges of town. A family arriving in a Buick might carry folded newspapers dense with global news in the glove compartment, only to leave them unopened while children drifted to sleep in the back seat. These contradictions were lived daily. The same household that tuned to Walter Cronkite for updates about testing grounds might, by evening, find itself lined up before a cartoon intermission reel promising hot dogs at the snack bar. Such juxtapositions were not an accident of scheduling, but of culture itself. They revealed how Americans learned to inhabit tension without collapsing into it, how they allowed ordinary joys to persist beside extraordinary fears. For many, the true definition of 1958 lay here, not purely in rockets, nor in baseball titles, nor in television comedies, but in the seamless way all of them folded together. People played, prayed, worried, and laughed without drawing a clear line between registers. The drive-in illustrated that blend by its very design. Giant screen for spectacle, gravel lot for routine, food stand for community, all under a sky alive with both stars and satellites. The audience held blankets for comfort, but also held an unspoken awareness of the bombs discussed in headlines. The glow of a soda machine and the glow of rocket launches both belong to the same American rhythm. It is tempting to call this the crest of drive-in culture, the moment when the outdoor theater best matched the spirit of the time. But looking closer reveals fragility. Larger currents swirled beyond the reach of neon and projector light. The pull of indoor entertainment, the looming weight of land values, the economic storms that would roll through in the following decades. For the moment, in 1958, things converged neatly. Families crowded in. Teenagers laughed from rows of Chevys, and children carried away memories that would shape their nostalgia long after individual titles were forgotten. Even amid all this brightness, you can almost sense what comes next. The subtle shift of balance, the slow unraveling of a ritual once thought unshakable. Why did one of America's brightest Saturday night rituals begin to slip quietly into the past? The fading of the drive-in was not sudden, not a collapse, but a slow retreat, drawn out over 2 decades. In the 1950s, when neat rows of cars stretched toward enormous screens, when families carried coolers of food and children scrambled between swings, it seemed impossible to imagine the night field losing its place. But as the 1960s and 1970s arrived, new pressures pressed steadily in. The golden moment that once seemed permanent began to dim, even as those memories held still in photographs and recollections. Part of the decline was economic. Land that once sat empty at the town's edge soon carried a new value. In the post-war years, developers and zoning boards looked at open drive-in fields not as cultural gathering places, but as future parking lots for malls, plots for supermarkets, or space for subdivisions. In 1958, at the peak, there were more than 4,000 drive-ins operating across the United States, a figure that testified to their place as part of suburban fabric. Yet within 20 years, those same gravel stretches were being sold and regraded, tilled not for storytelling, but for steady, taxable commerce. The glow of projector lamps could not compete with the security of rental income stores provided. Other pressures ran alongside land values. The car, once a symbol of freedom, now carried responsibilities sharper than excitement. Oil crises in the 1970s reshaped habits. Long weekend drives became indulgences few wanted to risk, while gasoline prices climbed and shortages kept motorists queued for hours. An evening at the drive-in, which once celebrated the car as leisure in itself, became harder to justify when every mile invited calculation. A night under the stars increasingly came to feel like a luxury, optional in the face of everyday worries. At the same moment, entertainment itself splintered. Multiplex theaters pressed forward, replacing the single-screen palace with 6 or 12 screens gathered beneath a single roof. Drive-ins still specialized in size. A single title splashed against a sky-high wall of light, but multiplexes offered range. Families stepping into air-conditioned lobbies could choose a drama, a comedy, or a cartoon all in the same night. It was choice that an outdoor lot could not match. Soon after, cable television multiplied channels inside the home, and by the late 1970s, video rentals added still another layer. Compared to those options, cheaper, closer, stocked with endless variety, a faraway gravel field seemed less necessary. The list of challenges soon grew familiar. Rising land values, oil shocks, television expanded into the living room, multiplexes, then VCRs, later on cable and satellite, and finally the move toward costly digital projection. Each eroded the drive-in's foundations. None alone was decisive, but together they pulled the ritual from center stage, reducing what had felt part of the nation's weekly rhythm to a smaller, more fragile tradition. By the early 1980s, the contraction was undeniable. Screens that once played to packed fields stood silent. Concession stands collapsed into weeds, and projector booths collected dust in their reels. Where once thousands of sites dotted the country, the number dwindled quickly. In fact, by the late 1980s, fewer than 200 drive-ins remained in operation, a dramatic descent from the more than 4,000 of their height. The change wasn't even. Some regions held on longer, others gave way quickly to development, but everywhere the scale of decline was unmistakable. The remains of those fields lingered like bones. Travelers drifting through rural towns found concrete towers looming strange against the horizon, paint peeling in long strips. A few rows of posts stood empty, speakers long since stolen or rusted, their wires frayed at the edges. Wide patches of gravel, weeds pushing through, marked tracks that once filled with children playing tag before the reels turned. Locals often knew exactly what had stood there, the shared, half-sorrowful recognition that a landmark of their youth had gone quiet. And yet, as lights dimmed across the land, the memory grew more luminous. Photographs and leather-bound albums showed children in pajamas, parents leaning in folding chairs, chrome catching the glow of cartoon reels during intermission. Retrospectives in newspapers spoke of a golden era, sweetened with nostalgia. Even those who hadn't lived through it adopted the images as cultural shorthand. Fogged windows, trunks opening with conspiratorial grins, tinny songs buzzing over static, while a starry background stretched above. Drive-ins became less a current destination than a remembered archetype, symbols of a certain innocence and of adolescence caught in transition. A few refused to go gently. Rural sites, where land was less contested, sometimes weathered the storms. Owners experimented, turning lots into flea markets by daylight and film venues by night, or pivoting toward classic double features that recollected the old hits. Technological improvements, like FM transmission replacing window speakers, gave new life to screenings, allowing sound to enter through car radios. Later still, the expense of digital projection strained fragile budgets, but enthusiasts and preservationists carried on. For the most part, though, these were gestures of revival rather than markers of growth. The drive-in had shifted from cultural engine to cultural relic, preserved with care rather than taken for granted. The difference between their peak and their afterlife couldn't have been clearer. In the boom years of 1958, miles of cars filled fields on a summer night. By the 1980s, the survivors endured mostly because of memory, nostalgia, or isolated geography. Crowds came, but often seeking to feel part of something already consigned to history. Even then, the light never vanished completely. A single screen in the countryside, a once-a-year gathering, or a retro movie weekend reminded Americans that the past had left traces, still flickering where sky and open ground met. History pressed forward, but the drive-in was never erased entirely, just softened into memory. Each rusting tower, each photograph, each fond retelling was another small spark against the dark. In the quiet stretch after the decline, the drive-in ceased to be strictly about profit or even about movies. It became a remembered atmosphere, a gentle echo of togetherness. And it is in those echoes that the story continues. Drive-ins were never just about films projected into the night. They were about neighbors crossing paths without needing to plan it, about families unwrapping sandwiches under the glow of dashboard lights, and about teenagers testing their first whispers of independence with windows nearly closed. The stories on the screen mattered, but the act of watching together, of being part of a gathering under open air, mattered even more. If this memory stirred something for you, share it in the comments. If you found this soothing, a gentle like, or a quiet subscription helps us continue these restful histories. So now, Let the reel slow in your own mind. Hear the hum of cars cooling, the rustle of popcorn bags, and the faint play of light across windshields fading into the dark. Good night.